sure if you polled this room, people would have different takes on what happened in places like Ferguson and New York. And let's face it, the media tends to focus on the sensational and the controversial, and folks on both sides who say stuff that's not designed to bring people together, but oftentimes makes the situation more polarized. And as a society, we tend to lurch from shock to complacency on these issues. And I'm suggesting we have to resist that impulse. With today's technology, if just one of your officers does something irresponsible, the whole world knows about it moments later. And the countless incidents of effective police work rarely make it on the evening news. So it's important for us not to just pounce and jump on anything that happens and immediately just draw conclusions. We've got to resist the false trap that says either there should be no accountability for police, or that every police officer is suspect no matter what they do. Neither of those things can be right. It's on all of us to let investigations uncover facts, to make sure that stories of misconduct aren't spread before we know the facts, and that they're not the only stories that we share. Because, as I said before, every day your officers aren't just stopping crimes, they're responding to emergencies and protecting victims of domestic violence and volunteering to coach Little League and refereeing pickup games. Those stories need to go viral as well. But you know as well as I do that the tensions in some communities, the feeling that law enforcement isn't always applied fairly, those sentiments don't just come out of nowhere. I mean, there's a long history here in this country. It's not something that any individual person here is responsible for, but we all have a responsibility to do something about it because it's part of our legacy. And I was at an event last week with LA's police chief, Charlie Beck. And we were asked about this issue of tensions and the feeling in minority communities that sometimes law enforcement isn't applied fairly. I repeated what I've said before, which is that there were times when I was younger, and maybe even as I got a little older, but before I had a motorcade, where I got pulled over. And I confessed, I told Chief Beck, most of the time I got a ticket, I deserved it. I knew why I was pulled over. But there were times where I didn't. And as a report that came out just this week reminded us, there are a lot of African Americans, not just me, who had that same kind of story of being pulled over or frisked or something. And the data shows that this is not an aberration. It doesn't mean each case is a problem. It means that when you aggregate all the cases and you look at it, you've got to say that there's some racial bias in the system. Now, problems of racial justice or injustice have been running themes throughout this country's history in every institution. In every institution. And, by the way, bias and stereotypes oftentimes go both ways. So eliminating bias is not something that falls on the police alone. The good news is our divides are not as deep as some would like to suggest. I will tell you, I don't know anybody in the minority community that does not want strong, effective law enforcement. I don't know anybody who doesn't want their kids to be safe when they're walking to school or playing on the playground. Everybody should understand that police officers do a dangerous job. Nobody wants to see police officers hurt. The question then is, how do we bridge these issues? Concern about fairness and concern about effectiveness of making sure the police officers get the support they need. That's why I set up a task force on 21st century policing last year that came up with detailed recommendations that departments and officers can implement to keep building trust. And I appreciate all the members, the IAC people who joined, fellow officers and community activists, and young people as part of that task force. I would urge all the chiefs here and all of you who are interested in this to look at the task force recommendations, because it was really interesting. You had people who were protesters in Ferguson sitting with police officers and police chiefs, and they came up with some shared recommendations. They talked about having open data and independent investigations to make sure the system was fair. They talked about helping law enforcement work with schools and businesses and youth groups so the kids who want to make a difference in their community say, when I grow up, I want to be a cop. Right here in Chicago, Mayor Emanuel and the Chicago PD have spent the past few years working to build on this philosophy, forming new partnerships with ministers, putting more officers on bikes and on foot so they can talk to residents. Earlier this year, I went to Camden, New Jersey, where they used to have complete mistrust between the department and local residents, and where the crime rate was sky high. And they're now using community policing and data to drive down crime. They've got a war room with cameras trained on hotspots around the city. And they've got software that lets community residents direct those cameras on where drug dealers or gangs are congregating. And that way local residents feel that they're not just being spied on, they're partners with the police. The police chief there trained their officers from the very first day. The officers would just be dropped off in the neighborhoods they were going to be serving and said, you're spending all day here without a car, figure it out. Which meant that if they even just wanted to go to the restroom, they'd have to get to know the local business. And they started meeting parents and communities. And that way they were, because they knew the communities they were serving, they were able to distinguish between the drug dealer and the good kid, even if both of them were wearing a hoodie. The police even bought 2 ice cream trucks with drug forfeiture money, and in the summer drove them into some neighborhoods where gangs had taken over. And drug dealers were peddling on the streets, and otherwise the street was empty. They drove those ice cream trucks, planted them there, and had police officers giving out free ice cream. And suddenly the community started coming out, and the drug dealers started fading away. All of a sudden, the street corners where criminals were dealing drugs had police officers dishing out free chocolate chip. But in all of these efforts, the goal was to get the community involved before a crime takes place, to build trust before a crisis erupts. And officers then feel more welcome to their communities, citizens are more likely to cooperate with the police, and that makes us all safer. Now, look, I'm not naive. I'm not suggesting that any of this is easy. A lot of times it means more resources for police departments because it's more labor intensive. If you want that kind of community policing, then you got to have enough police to be able to do that, because it takes time to do more than just respond to a call. And I don't want to suggest that we're ever going to eliminate all misunderstandings or stereotypes between police officers and minority communities. It's certainly not going to happen overnight, and it's especially tough because there's more crime in these communities, which means the police are interacting with them more than they are in some fancy neighborhoods. Good community policing has to be a two-way street. The communities that desperately need effective policing have to give police officers the benefit of the doubt. And have to work with the police department to make sure you've got the resources and support to effectively implement the strategies that we know work. And the flip side of it is when an individual officer does display bias or excessive force, which is going to happen. Just like there are going to be politicians who do stupid things, or business leaders who do something. There's no profession that doesn't have somebody who sometimes screws up. Then we've got to have departments to honestly and fairly address it, and not just simply close ranks or stand down.
Не просто там фильтры были, и как-то заниматься